You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Marion Devine. I'm your host today, and I'm a senior researcher at the Conference Board. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Insights. And this is a series which helps talent executives address challenges and stay informed about current issues across the whole spectrum of human capital. This series is brought to you by the Conference Board. And today I'm really delighted to be sitting down with Anne Stevens to discuss our latest research, which is the CHRO's role in navigating the future of work. And I think it's a great opportunity to have Anne. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
And Anne, I think, is going to just bring a really interesting perspective to us today. Anne is one of our council directors, and she's council director for several I think really interesting groups, including our CHRO council and also our HR executive council, who tend to be the heads of EMEA of human capital. And also Anne is council director for our Global Women in Business Council. So she brings a really rich perspective. But in addition to that, Anne herself has had a very successful corporate career at Rio Tinto and IBM. And currently now she has a portfolio of activities including directorships of charities and also non-executive directorships as well. So a very rich perspective. So welcome, Anne. So just to set the scene, obviously we are talking about the future of work, and we went to CHROs, and across the globe we held focus group discussions with CHROs in Asia, in Europe and the United States. And we included our councils as well. So thank you very much to them. We got input from several of our councils. And we were really asking CHROs about their current, but more importantly, I think their future plans, their future states, where they thought work was changing. So we looked at a number of themes around the purpose of business and leadership, how work gets done, the workplace, the role of the HR function, and very importantly, the role of the CHRO. So a number of very rich themes. And today we're just going to focus on three, which is around purpose, leadership, and the role of the CHRO. But before we do that, I think we need to acknowledge where we are today and the fact that there are some very momentous and very disturbing and concerning events going on in Europe. And many of our members have operations and people in Ukraine, in Russia. And so we know that many of our members are very concerned. And from your members who are obviously talking with each other and with you, what are you seeing today in terms of the challenges and the concerns of companies and these senior leaders?
Thank you, Marion, and good morning, everybody. Yes, obviously the events in Ukraine have taken a major focus for our CHROs and our European HR execs. And by coincidence, I was at a 2-day HR director retreat last Thursday and Friday. So this was very much top of mind. So clearly a major focus from a people perspective, but also from a business perspective. Some of the more pragmatic things I'm seeing. First of all, I'm really encouraged that people are actually connecting and exchanging ideas and examples of what they're doing company to company, which is very positive. So some of the practical things, things like moving forward salary payments to their employees in the Ukraine. They've brought forward their March salary payments. They've introduced loans. They've actually, some companies are actually facilitating relocation to neighbouring countries, for example, Poland. One organisation I know had rented a number of properties across the border to try and relocate and safely house their employees that are currently were currently working in the Ukraine. They're also thinking about the rest of the workforce because, of course, everybody wants to help in these situations. And I think it's very important that the organisations take a concerted and an organised effort around what they can do, first for their people in Ukraine, but how other people in the organisation can help. So some early signs, I think, that people are moving relatively quickly where they can. Obviously, not everybody can relocate everybody out of Ukraine, and so they're offering as much support, well-being, connection as they can to their employees. But it's an evolving discussion and an evolving situation, as we know. That's probably as much as I've seen at the moment, Marion, but I think people are very much focused on staying connected and talking to each other around what they can do to ensure everybody is feeling as well supported as they can be.
Absolutely, thank you, Anne. And we will keep monitoring for the sake of our members and connecting them and really helping them to exchange practical action and strategies. So, I mean, and I think that's sort of, in a way, it does feed into our first topic, which is around the purpose of business, and this is something we asked about to our CHROs, and I think that many of them said that the purpose of their business will stay the same, but during COVID, that was a real litmus test for whether their purpose really was a compass through crisis and uncertainty. And here again, we have a new crisis. So the purpose of the business is very much around, obviously, hitting your targets, making money, but also serving your stakeholders, who are your customers, but your employees, your communities, the places where you are operating in. And I think as well, we're seeing this whole widening shift for business in terms of really focusing on purpose as it pertains to the environment, to your social responsibilities. So we're seeing a sort of shifting in there, and I think as well, what CEOs have sort of said to us that they will leverage these evolutions in purpose to really be aware that this is a competitive advantage, both to attract and retain talent, and to be seen as a responsible business. So Anne, coming back to you, what do you see around purpose and especially this wider context in which businesses find themselves, where there are all sorts of, in the external environment, all sorts of disruptions and crises going on?
Yes, thank you, Marion. Well, the first thing I should say is that way before the pandemic, organisations that I've been working with have been talking about purpose. They've been honing, clarifying, and focusing on exactly what their purpose is. And I think the pandemic has really accelerated some of that work. And it's also changed the direction for many organisations, of course. But I think, from my perspective, purpose is all about bringing clarity to people. It's about bringing clarity to all of your stakeholders, your workforce, to your customers, to your investors, and it gives everybody a clear sense of alignment around that sense of purpose once it's established. I think it's also around creating a culture where people really can align themselves in a consistent way, so people understand very clearly what the organisation's about and can get behind it. I think there's another angle to purpose, though, and that is about addressing clearly now many social issues. This whole sustainability, the environmental, social, and governance issues that we're hearing about so much are coming very much to the fore. And I think that in turn then allows organisations to use their purpose, not just for their existing workforce, but to attract talent, to drive their equality and their inclusion agenda, be very clear about their values, thinking about how they can get people aligned behind all of those things. Just an example of this, which might bring it to life for people listening, is I visited a pharmaceutical company in Europe not that long ago, actually, and they have a very clear purpose around transforming lives of people living with severe diseases. And their mantra is that the patient is at the centre of everything they do. So that, they would say they're inspired by patients and driven by science. I have to say, having visited that organisation, I was overwhelmed and very impressed by the fact that everybody I spoke to in that organisation, irrespective of level, irrespective of role, was very clear about the purpose, very aligned behind what the organisation was trying to do, and they understood very clearly and very easily where their role fitted into that wider sense of purpose. And it was a really overwhelming and very impressive feeling when you were talking to people in that organisation, and it shows, I think, how powerful that sense of purpose can be. I guess the other thing I would say is that purpose written down on a piece of paper is one thing, but purpose needs to be brought to life. It has to be real. And actually, I think the pandemic has actually raised expectations of investors and all stakeholders, and they expect purpose to be linked to performance and action. So it has to have some substance. I think organisations that espouse a purpose but don't put real substance behind it will suffer some backlash going forward. It needs to be something that can be measured and seen in action. And I guess the last thing I would say is that in my experience, people are much more productive, more motivated, more energized when they understand and believe in what they're working towards. They can become engaged and connected to a unifying purpose. So very, very important, I think, more than ever today.
Absolutely. And again, I think we saw that in the pandemic when we saw companies who were, for example, manufacturing, producing perfume, swapping and, everyone very much behind that to hand sanitizers. That purpose, I think, just was the compass through. And absolutely, when it comes to the research that we've done, there are, I think, in terms of closing the gap, helping companies to get to where they want to be. I think absolutely your emphasis on tangible steps. Companies do have to take tangible steps. They really have to show their commitment to their purpose, and they have to show how this is linked to certain things like metrics, the investments they're making, the decisions they're making in terms of, perhaps, whether they do extend their portfolio into fossil fuels or not, etc. So there are all sorts of really sort of every moment where companies can show that they are true to their purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think as well, again, saying about the need of leaders to just keep articulating, keep showing that connection to purpose. And in fact, something I like very much is that Unilever, in their sort of concept of well-being, have built-in purpose into that. That's one of the sort of 4 pillars of well-being, and they hold purpose workshops. And I think many thousands of employees have gone through these workshops to talk about their own values, their own sense of purpose, and to get that sort of connected to the business, and to see the lens of the purpose of the business, but also through their own values and things. So I think that's really, really excellent. I think as well we're noticing that ESG, well, for human capital teams, the S, social, is really important, and actually it's rather underdeveloped. And there's a lot that companies can do, I think, to move forward that agenda and to think more and more widely, not just talking about your D&I metrics, which are really important, but also thinking about social responsibilities more widely. So I think we're going to see some changes there. Right, so I think that moves us on quite sort of logically into the role of the CHRO. And we talked, we asked CHROs, did they have a sense of how their role is changing? And we know that CHROs, lead large, complex organizations. They lead multidisciplinary teams. They're leading talent strategies and people processes and culture. So it is a complex role. And we also know that sort of in past times, very much the CHRO plays a critical role as a trusted advisor to the CEO. And also many CHROs are strategic thought partners with the board of directors and the executive leadership team. So it's a complex and very demanding role. But when our CHROs talked about, how that role will change, they saw it as really broadening, as a business leader with responsibilities expanding beyond traditional HR, much more on that focus on value creation, outcomes for stakeholders, looking at healthy and sustainable businesses, ESG, looking at the role of technology and big themes like human-centric organizations that do harness technology. So, Anne, I know that, again, you've got some quite strong views about, the role of the CHRO as a business leader. So, please share those thoughts with us.
No, thank you, Marion. I think I've always felt very strongly that a CHRO should be first and foremost a business leader. Unfortunately, in the past, that has not always been the view of many organizations, but that's most definitely changing. And if anything, I think the pandemic, we talk about disruption, but the pandemic most certainly accelerated the need for a strong people agenda driven by the CHRO and the HR operation. So I think, clearly a business leader steering the organization through disruption from a strategic perspective, but particularly in terms of looking ahead at the future. Every organization I'm working with is thinking about the future of work, the future of the workplace, the future workforce, and in that category or that topic, I would say the whole area of talent, well-being, future working arrangements, future of leadership, all comes into play. They're using much more agile, much more technology, much more innovation types of approaches. And of course, they're all about shaping the culture now more than they've probably ever been. So the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion discussion comes to play. And I think also employee experience and driving that agenda as part of the strategic business imperative of a company is becoming much more to the fore. Um, Again, if I may, I'd like to give you an example. I mean, Tetra Pak, this is in the public domain. There's nothing that I'm going to tell you that's secret. But, their CHRO, Philip Reed, he's commented publicly that, over a decade ago, they started to evolve the HR operation, driven by the absolute conviction and clarity that HR's purpose is to deliver success through the people and help create a business of the future. So they started that work a decade ago, and yet still it continues. I think the other key thing is this whole area of employees having a much stronger view about wanting flexibility from their employer. We're in a time of skill shortage and we've got high turnovers. We've seen, what's labelled the Great Resignation. So there's lots of turnover going on in organisations. So I think organisations that can offer, their employees visibility and options for when they work, where they work, I think it can be a positive differentiator and make the organisation a much more appealing place to work. And of course, the CHRO, the role is right at the centre of all of that work, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think our own work on sort of flexible working arrangements, we're seeing a very big demand in some of the surveys that we've ran. There's been a real shift, I think, with employees around the globe saying that they want to work more flexibly. In Europe, it's a challenge in some ways because of a sort of different types of legislation, different ways of categorizing workers. And there's changing legislation, and there's legislation like the right to switch off, which is again going to affect how companies do manage flexible work arrangements. But I think something interesting that we've seen in our C-suite challenge, a global survey that we send out to the C-suite, is that at the very top of organizations, there is strong support for flexible working. But lower down, we see some resistance, sort of maybe at the middle level of organisations, where leaders are not necessarily comfortable about this shift, and it requires them to work in different ways. So just to finish off, thank you, Anne, for your comments on the role of the CHRO, and I think that we know that there will be a growing necessity for CHROs to really act as a public voice on social issues, and to really champion workers as well in a very complex world, technology-driven world, and a world of disruption. So I think that this is it's a great role, really, and let's hope that the HR community can really pull in and develop great talent to step into this role.
Marion, if I may just add something, sorry. I mean, I'm just playing my mind back to the last few days where I was with a group of CHROs, as I mentioned. And one of the things I would say, having spoken to so many CHROs, new and experienced CHROs, is it's important, I think, as a CHRO to recognise, first of all, this whole piece around being a business leader, but also as a business leader to really find your voice and stand up and speak for what you believe is the right thing for your business and for your people and for your organisation, probably more than it's ever been before.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of the CHROs in our research shared with us how in his company the role of the CHRO is actually being divided into three main responsibilities. And I think this is very interesting how they've decided to sort of articulate that role. Firstly, to serve as an innovator by architecting new ways to attract and retain talent. Mm-hmm. So innovation and talent sort of together. Acting as a cultural carrier by preserving what's really good, but aggressively pursuing ways to improve the culture. And that's, you were saying, Anne, about this cultural sort of role. And thirdly, to be the corporate conscience by really being dialed into the diversity of employee experience and influencing systemic change. So I think it's a really interesting example of how a company has defined the role of the CHRO going forward. So moving on to our final theme, which is about leaders, and what did CHROs think about how leadership was changing. And of course we know, and in fact we've done some other research in Europe with some focus groups asking that same question to senior executives about how they understood the role to be changing. We know that leaders will always still have to have strong skills in vision setting, strategic direction, strategic implementation, hitting those organizational goals. All those things will never go away. But I think also we know that the sort of how of leadership is changing. We know that leaders will have to increasingly lead people through ambiguity, through disruption. And so the theme that's really come out is in both our sets of work is saying that, there will be very high expectations around leaders' level of, firstly, obviously, business acumen, that ability to drive and execute strategy, but also their cultural skills to lead teams, to display empathy, to connect people to company purpose, to find ways to really release innovation. So creating those conditions for their people to succeed. So Anne, again, have you, when you think about what you're seeing with leadership, does this sort of resonate with what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely, Marion. And again, I come back to, I think, the thing that the pandemic has done for us, whether we like it or not, it's really made us rethink our organizational strategies, but in particular, leadership from a style perspective. I think, leaders have had to do a lot more listening than they have previously. And I think they've had to take much more of what I would call a partnership approach with their employees and their workers. And I'm sure people have heard the term employee activism. There seems to be an awful lot of employee activism present in virtually everybody, every organization I talk with. They're all talking about employee activism in a positive way, by the way. This is not a negative thing. This is about employees feeling more comfortable, more confident with their leaders, and being able to have more of a say in, as I mentioned earlier, how, when, and where they work, and who they work for, of course. So I think, the new style, or the developing style of leadership that I'm seeing, as I mentioned, is all about listening. I think it's all about being prepared to share wisdom, share their own vulnerability, real stories, demonstrating the sort of their humanness, if you like, with their employees, demonstrating empathy probably more than ever. But at the same time, linking back to our previous conversation, being very clear about the purpose of what the organization is trying to do and how their people get aligned to that. The other thing I'm finding, and this relates very much to perhaps what I would call a younger generation, is that leaders need to be relevant to their employees across multi-generations, but in particular for younger employees, they want leaders they can relate to. So a leader has to be relevant and relatable to their workforce and to their employees, and I think they do that by bringing some fresh thinking, staying connected to the outside world, being curious about their own industry and external industries, and also having, I think, much more probably technical know-how than they've perhaps had to have in the past. Very important now. Can I give you an example of what some of the things I'm seeing out in the market? I mean, Microsoft, for example, is a great organization to look at. They've had a really big shift in their approach to leadership over the last few years, and they see it as a critical, successful business factor, their leadership style, because of its direct impact on organizational health, employee performance, how shareholders and investors see the organization, as well as clients and, of course, suppliers. So, I think their ethos is that, leading a big company doesn't have to come with a big ego. In fact, a big ego could actually be detrimental to the success of a company these days. Very different from perhaps leadership ranks of the past that we may have seen. And I think taking an empathetic and gentle approach to the value that each employee can bring and encouraging them to be and to do their best drives a culture of innovation and collaboration. And I've seen that very much, as I say, with Microsoft in terms of how they are approaching their, if you like, their people first agenda. They would articulate the role of the leader is to boost and bolster confidence of the people they're leading, working together as one team, being able to understand and share the feelings of other individuals, creating a greater perspective on life with the idea that everybody's working towards something together. So I think, that combined with transparency, being more perhaps authentic than leaders have been in the past. And actually, I noticed this literally last week at this event I mentioned to you, a big face-to-face event, first one I've been to for some time. Leaders were definitely more authentic and more transparent about their experience, particularly over the last 2 years, more so than you would ever have seen previously. So I think, this whole responsive style of leadership is going to become very important. And I guess the other thing I would say is that employee experience is going to count for everything in this new world of work. There's no question about that. So linking it back to, once again, values, purpose, empathy, good leaders need to demonstrate actions and behaviors that translate that into employee engagement, empowerment, motivation, so that everybody in the organization can succeed.
Absolutely. And something that in one of our focus groups, one executive said, and I love this sort of quote, and he said, you really have to think about, what does it mean to be a leader? What does it mean to be an authentic leader when everybody can see into my room, they can see my family, they can see my child wandering in, they can see dogs and cats, etc. And, I can't lean on offices and cars and all those trappings of leadership. I have to be an authentic leader in this new context, and I thought that was a great way to sort of visualize that. So Anne, we're kind of coming to the end of our time now for this podcast, and it's been really fascinating, and it's been really great to get your perspective on it. For our members, our report will be available very soon, and I hope that they will find that a very stimulating vehicle for further discussion between CHROs and the C-suite, but also with their own leadership teams. But going forward, Anne, obviously the future of work is a big agenda. And, CHROs, there are so many different areas to be focusing on. And if there was sort of one takeaway for a CHRO, what would you say was the sort of most important area where they can really have impact?
I think probably one of the biggest things is around equipping leaders, actually, in terms of, emphasizing, if you like, agile teams, high-performing teams, but of course always linking it back to purpose. I think that's really important. So everything around the people agenda, the leadership agenda, needs to link back to that purpose, and not just for people within the organization. As I mentioned earlier, all stakeholders, so governments, investors, clients, suppliers, and of course our own workforces. That would be my key takeaway.
Well, thank you again, Anne, and thanks to our audience. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our Insights podcast series, or explore the whole catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board. And you can do this by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.